This happened during the fall of my sophomore year of college. I was living in a cheap, 6-story apartment building just a few blocks away from campus. Because the rent was so low, the building attracted a pretty weird mix of college students, transient workers, and people who just wanted to be left alone. I'm naturally an introvert, and my social anxiety was pretty severe at the time, so I didn't mind the isolation. I had a routine. I would go to my classes, come back to room 3B, lock the door, and spend the rest of the night reading or gaming.
Around October, a new tenant moved into the apartment directly across the hall from me, room 3C. I first noticed him when I was taking out the trash on a Tuesday evening. He was standing in his open doorway, holding a cardboard box, just looking out into the hallway. He was a tall, thin man, probably in his late 40s, wearing a faded gray flannel shirt and dark trousers. His hair was slightly disheveled, but the thing that immediately caught my attention was his face. It was completely expressionless.
Being polite, I gave him a small nod and said, "Hey, welcome to the floor." The man didn't move. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, and he literally didn't make a sound. He just stared right through me with these cold, completely vacant eyes. I figured he was just exhausted from moving, or maybe he didn't speak English, so I just walked past him and went down the hall. But as I waited for the elevator, I looked back. He was still standing in the exact same position, clutching that box, staring at the empty space where I had just been standing.
He was still standing in the exact same position, clutching that box, staring at the empty space where I had just been standing. Over the next 2 weeks, the silence from room 3C became a regular part of the floor. I would see him in the laundry room or by the mailboxes, and every single time I tried to acknowledge him, he would just freeze. He wouldn't look angry, and he wouldn't look scared. He just looked like a machine that had suddenly been unplugged.
I started overthinking the situation, wondering if he was a mute, or maybe he was suffering from some kind of profound psychological trauma. I actually started to feel bad for the guy, thinking he was just deeply isolated from the world. But then, the behavior started shifting from awkward to genuinely disturbing.
It started with the peephole. My apartment door had a small, cheap brass peephole. One night, around 1 a.m., I was sitting on my couch watching a movie with my headphones on. I happened to look toward the front door, and I noticed a slight disruption in the light coming through the lens. Someone was standing on the other side of the door. I took off my headphones, crept over to the entryway, and looked through. It was him. The man from 3C was standing inches from my door, his face pressed almost directly against the wood. He wasn't trying to turn the handle. He wasn't knocking. He was just standing there in the dim yellow light of the hallway, listening. I stood there for 10 minutes, paralyzed with anxiety, waiting for him to move. He never did.
He just remained perfectly still, a silent statue outside my apartment. The climax of this nightmare happened 3 days later. I had fallen asleep on my living room futon around midnight. I woke up abruptly at 3:15 a.m. to a freezing draft hitting my face. When I opened my eyes, my apartment door was wide open, letting the cold air from the hallway pour inside. I knew for a fact I had locked it, but the deadbolt was entirely retracted.
And then I saw him. The man from 3C was sitting in the dark on my kitchen chair, right next to the counter. He had his hands folded neatly in his lap. He was just sitting there, staring at me while I slept.
I scrambled backward on the futon, my heart violently slamming against my ribs. I screamed at him. "Who are you? What are you doing in my apartment? Get out." He didn't jump. He didn't panic. He slowly stood up from the chair, maintaining absolute, unbroken silence. He didn't mutter a threat. He didn't make a sound. He just walked out into the hallway, crossed over to his own apartment, and gently closed his door behind him. I locked my door, jammed a chair under the knob, and stayed up with a baseball bat until sunrise. The landlord called the police the next morning when I reported the break-in. When the officers forced their way into room 3C, they found out the man was gone. But the apartment wasn't empty. There was no furniture, no clothes, no boxes. The only things inside were hundreds of small, blank index cards taped to the walls. On the back of every single card, written in tiny, immaculate print, was a timestamp. The police realized they were the exact times I had opened and closed my front door over the last month. The man had literally been tracking my entire life without ever uttering a single syllable. They never caught him, and when they looked into the lease, the name he used belonged to a man who had passed away 10 years prior. I moved out that same weekend, because the idea that someone can be that close to you, documenting your every breath without ever saying a word, that is a level of silent malice that literally never leaves your mind.
This happened about 3 years ago when I was working as a late-night night auditor for a hotel downtown. Because I didn't own a car at the time, my only real option for getting home at 3 a.m. was taking the city's commuter train. If you have ever been to a transit station in a major city at that hour, you already know it is a completely different world. The bustling crowds from the daytime are entirely gone, and the only people left are the ones who have nowhere else to go. I am naturally a massive overthinker, and my anxiety was always on a hair trigger during those late-night commutes. I would always keep my headphones in, even if I wasn't listening to anything, just so people would leave me alone. On a freezing rainy night in November, I walked down the concrete steps to platform 4 to wait for the 3:15 a.m. train. The platform was completely empty except for a single flickering fluorescent light at the far end of the tracks. The air smelled like damp concrete and old metal. I sat down on one of the metal benches, pulling my jacket tight around my neck, just staring at the tracks. About 5 minutes passed, and then I heard the heavy security door at the top of the stairs click open. I didn't look up immediately, because overthinking taught me that eye contact with strangers at 3 a.m. is usually a bad idea. But out of the corner of my eye, I watched a man walk down the stairs. I took one headphone out, cleared my throat, and said, "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't say a word. He didn't even blink. He just stared down at me, his eyes wide and completely vacant underneath the hood of that bright yellow jacket. I figured maybe he was just high or heavily intoxicated, so I put my headphone back in, looked down at my phone, and tried to ignore him. But the sheer weight of his presence was suffocating. I could literally hear the rain dripping off his jacket onto the concrete floor. Drip, drip, drip. I looked up again after 2 minutes, and he hadn't moved a single inch. He was still standing right over me, staring down at the top of my headrest. At this point, the paranoia was starting to turn into genuine panic. I stood up from the bench, packed my bag, and walked about 50 feet down the platform to get some space. I didn't run because I didn't want to trigger an aggressive reaction. I stopped near the edge of the platform and looked back over my shoulder. The man had turned around. He was now walking toward me again, maintaining that exact same rigid, locked-arm posture. I told him, "Look, man, I don't have any cash on me. Just back off."
Absolute silence. He didn't yell, he didn't mutter, he didn't make a single human vocalization. He just kept marching forward at a perfectly steady pace. I started backing away, my boots sliding slightly on the wet concrete. I was trapped on a narrow platform with a sheer drop to the tracks on my left and a solid concrete wall on my right. I kept expecting him to pull out a weapon or sprint at me or scream something crazy. But the total lack of sound was 1,000 times worse than a threat. You can't reason with a person who refuses to participate in human communication.
Just as I was about to drop my bag and prepare to defend myself, the distant rumble of the train echoed through the tunnel. The headlights flooded the platform with a blinding white light. The screeching of the metal brakes was incredibly loud, filling the empty station. I stood right near the edge of the yellow safety line, watching the doors slide open. I practically threw myself inside the train car, turning around immediately to face the platform. The man in the yellow raincoat didn't try to follow me onto the train. Instead, he stood right on the edge of the platform, inches from the closing glass doors. He slowly raised his right hand. He didn't wave. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a large, heavy pair of industrial metal wire cutters. He pressed the cold metal blades directly against the glass window of the train door, right where my face was. He didn't speak. He just slowly squeezed the handles together, mimicking a cutting motion, while staring directly into my eyes with that completely empty expression. The train finally lurched forward and pulled into the dark tunnel, leaving him behind on the platform. I sat down in the empty train car, my hands shaking so violently I could barely lock my phone. I told the transit security guard at the next station, and they pulled the security tapes from platform 4. The police later told me that the man didn't enter the station through the turnstiles. He had crawled up onto the platform directly from the dark, active train tunnels deeper in the subway system. They found a backpack hidden in a maintenance alcove down there containing clothing from 3 different people, but they never found the man.
I quit my night shift job the very next week. I will literally never take public transit after dark ever again. Because the idea that someone can crawl out of the pitch black tunnels, follow you in total silence, and tell you exactly what they want to do to you without ever making a single sound, that is a level of psychological malice that stays with you for the rest of your life.
I have always been a massive extrovert. I thrive around people, I love networking, and my entire career in corporate sales was built on my ability to talk my way into or out of literally any situation. My wife, Juliana, comes from an incredibly wealthy background, and for our 3rd wedding anniversary, her family allowed us to use their private, uninhabited island off the coast of Maine for a weekend getaway. It was a beautiful, isolated slice of land with a modern cabin, dense pine forests, and a private rocky beach. We had a local boat captain drop us off on a Friday morning, and we were scheduled to be picked up on Sunday afternoon. There was absolutely no cell service, no internet, and no other human beings for miles. On Saturday afternoon, I decided to surprise Juliana with an elaborate picnic on the far northern point of the island. It was a clear, crisp day, and we set up a large blanket on a grassy bluff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. I was in my element, pouring wine, laughing, and talking about our future plans. But around 3 p.m., the atmosphere on that bluff completely shifted. Juliana suddenly stopped mid-sentence, her glass freezing halfway to her mouth. She was staring past my shoulder, toward the tree line where the dense pine forest met the grass. I turned around, expecting to see a deer or maybe a large bird. Instead, a man was standing right on the edge of the shadows. He was wearing a thick, dirty burlap-style tunic and heavy work boots. He had a rugged beard, but his posture was completely rigid. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, about 30 feet away, staring directly at our picnic setup. Being an extrovert, my immediate instinct wasn't fear, it was communication. I figured maybe he was a stranded fisherman or a local poacher who didn't realize the island was private property.
I stood up, put on my best friendly salesman smile, and called out, "Hey there, are you doing all right? Do you need some help?" The man didn't respond. He didn't blink, he didn't raise a hand, and he literally didn't make a single sound. He just stood there like a stone statue, his eyes entirely locked onto mine. I walked forward about 10 feet, trying to project a confident, commanding presence. I said, "Look, this is a private island. We have a boat coming back soon, but if you're stranded, I can give you some water or food." Still, absolute silence. The wind was whipping through the pine trees, but this man didn't shift his weight a single inch. His expression was completely blank, totally devoid of any human emotion or recognition. It was like trying to talk to a brick wall. My overthinking kicked into overdrive.
I started looking at his hands to see if he had a knife or a firearm, but they were tucked flat against his sides. The total refusal to speak was deeply unnatural. In my line of work, if someone doesn't like what you're saying, they argue or they walk away. But this complete, silent observation was terrifying. I walked back to the blanket, keeping my eyes on him. I told Juliana in a low voice to pack up the basket immediately. We gathered our things, and as we began walking down the coastal path back toward our cabin, I looked over my shoulder. The man had stepped out of the woods. He was following us. He wasn't running, and he wasn't making any stealthy movements. He was just matching our walking pace perfectly, keeping that exact 30-foot distance, moving in total eerie silence. We reached the cabin, ran inside, and I slammed the heavy wooden door, sliding the deadbolt into place. I checked every single window, locking them tightly. Juliana was terrified, crying quietly in the kitchen while I tried to figure out what to do. I had no phone signal, and the boat captain wasn't due back for another 20 hours. I grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth and stood by the front window, peering through the blinds. He was standing right in the middle of our gravel driveway. He just stood there in the bright afternoon sun, staring at the front door. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, plunging the island into complete darkness. We didn't turn on a single light inside the cabin because we didn't want him to know which room we were in. Around midnight, the silence was broken by a soft, rhythmic sound. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't a violent pounding. Someone was gently pressing their bare forehead against the glass of our bedroom window. I crept into the room, holding the fire poker tight. The moonlight was reflecting off his pale, dirty face. He had his forehead pressed directly against the glass, his eyes wide open, staring into the dark room. He wasn't trying to break the glass. He was just looking. I lost my temper from pure panic and screamed at the top of my lungs. "I will literally kill you if you break that window. Get away from my wife."
He didn't flinch. He didn't yell back. He slowly pulled his forehead away from the glass, leaving a greasy smudge behind. He turned around and walked back into the darkness of the trees, completely silent. We spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor of the cabin hallway, holding each other, waiting for the sound of shattering glass that never came.
At 11 a.m. the next morning, the sound of our boat captain's motor echoed across the water. We didn't even pack our bags. We ran out of that cabin, sprinted down the dock, and threw ourselves onto the boat, screaming at the captain to floor the engine. The captain was confused, but when he looked back toward the island's shoreline, he stopped talking. The man was standing on the rocky beach. He had gathered our abandoned picnic blanket and wrapped it tightly around his shoulders. He didn't wave goodbye, and he didn't chase the boat. He just stood on the rocks, a silent, solitary figure, watching us disappear into the ocean fog.
When the maritime police investigated the island the next day, they found a hidden underground bunker from World War II deep in the center of the forest. Inside, they found evidence that this man had been living on the island completely alone for nearly 15 years. He was an escaped convict from a mainland prison who had fled a decade and a half prior. The police told us that after so many years of absolute isolation, his brain had likely undergone a profound psychological shift. He had literally forgotten how to speak, how to interact, and how to be a human being.
We never went back to that island, and Juliana's family actually ended up selling the property a few months later. I still handle major corporate clients every day, and I talk to hundreds of people a week. But every time a room goes completely quiet, or every time someone pauses just a little too long before answering a question, I feel a cold sweat break out on my neck. Because, well, I don't have any good reason for that. Well, it may be trauma, but I don't think so. But this world is big. There are people, like me, who can't stay quiet. And there are people like those, who stayed quiet for half of their lives.
Thank you for watching this far, if you actually made it, because 90% of people clicking this video won't make it out this long, and I would appreciate if you liked the video. Bye. Have a great day.